In a room of geniuses blinded by pride, they dismissed the quiet woman in the corner. They never thought to ask a ghost how to command the shadows, and their billion-dollar war machine was about to become a billion-dollar crater. The air inside the Nevada High-Altitude Aerodynamics Test Center, HAC, tasted of ozone and chilled coolant, a sterile cocktail for the nation's brightest minds. Dust, fine as powdered sugar, coated everything, a constant reminder of the vast, unforgiving desert just outside the windowless walls. It clung to the matte black transport that deposited Dr. Eris Thorne at the main gate, a solitary figure against the indifferent landscape. The guards, young men with crisp uniforms and the easy confidence of those holding small measures of power, glanced at her attire with practiced disinterest. She wore a faded gray hoodie, worn tactical cargo pants, and a pair of scuffed, brand-agnostic hiking boots that suggested hard miles over hard terrain. Her paperwork identified her as a technical consultant, a title vague enough to mean anything and, to them, specific enough to mean nothing. One of them grunted, jerking a thumb toward the sprawling hangar that dominated the compound. "In there. Don't wander." She gave a single, barely perceptible nod and walked past them, her footsteps making no sound on the crushed gravel. The hangar itself was a cathedral of controlled chaos. A team of engineers and pilots, mostly men younger than her 30-some years, were gathered around a central command console, their voices sharp with disagreement. They were the nation's best, plucked from elite universities and top-flight squadrons, and their collective arrogance was a tangible force field. On the massive holographic display that covered one wall, angry red error codes flashed in a relentless, accusing rhythm. No one noticed her entry. She was just another shadow in a place built of them. She found an unoccupied corner near a secondary power conduit, set down her single duffel bag, and began to watch. Her stillness was an anomaly in the constant, agitated motion of the room. It was not the stillness of timidity, but of patience, the deep, ingrained discipline of a predator waiting for the hunt to begin. Colonel Marcus Vance, the base commander, finally found the time to address the consultant he'd been told to expect. He was a man shaped like a bulldog, his posture a testament to a career spent giving orders and having them followed. His gaze was filled with a weary contempt for the bureaucratic hurdles that forced people like her into his world. He held her personnel file in his hand, though it was less a file and more a single sheet of paper, thin and insulting in its brevity. Most of it was blacked out with thick, unapologetic redactions. "Thorne," he said, his voice clipped, not bothering to make eye contact as he scanned the page. "Says here you have some field experience with remote systems." The slight pause he injected dripped with condescension. He looked up, his eyes sweeping over her unassuming frame. He saw nothing of value. "We have pilots with thousands of hours in the most advanced fighters on the planet. We have engineers with doctorates from Caltech and MIT. Their resumes are somewhat more substantial than this one-page joke." He let the single page flutter from his fingers onto the desk between them. Captain Leo "Viper" Gallo, the lead test pilot, stood nearby, a smirk playing on his lips. He was handsome, his hair perfectly coiffed, and he wore an expensive diver's watch that was a stark, arrogant contrast to his flight suit. He saw Eris as an administrative burden. "With all due respect, Colonel," Gallo chimed in, his tone making it clear no respect was intended, "we're neck-deep in diagnostics. We don't really have time to babysit someone from tech support." Vance gave a slight nod, his gaze returning to Eris, cold and dismissive. "So, I'll ask you directly. What exactly do you believe you can contribute to Project Chimera?" The question was a challenge, a demand for a justification she was not expected to provide. Eris's eyes were steady, her expression unreadable. Her focus was on the drone, visible through the reinforced glass of Vance's office. "I'm here to observe the system," she stated, her voice quiet but firm. It was a simple declaration of fact that seemed to irritate Vance more than an argument would have. He waved a hand, a gesture of finality. "Fine. Observe. Just stay out of the way of the people who are actually doing the work." For the next 3 days, Eris Thorne became part of the hangar's architecture. She stood in the periphery, a silent observer, her presence so unobtrusive that the team soon forgot she was there. They took to calling her the scribe or the shadow in their infrequent, mocking asides, noting the small, leather-bound notebook she carried. She made meticulous entries, but she wasn't watching the pilots or the engineers. She was watching the data. While the engineers dove into oceans of corrupted code and the pilots complained about the violent neural feedback, Eris watched the energy schematics. She saw what they missed: infinitesimal fluctuations in the power distribution of Project Chimera, subtle energy spikes in the drone's biomimetic processors that corresponded not to pilot input, but to atmospheric variables. She cross-referenced them with public data feeds on her encrypted tablet, noting shifts in barometric pressure, humidity, and even solar flare activity. The system wasn't just unstable, it was sensitive. It was responding to the world around it in ways its creators had never intended. They were trying to cage a wild animal, and it was fighting back. Her gaze would often settle on the drone itself. Resting on a raised platform in the center of the hangar, the Chimera was less an aircraft and more a creature carved from solidified shadow, like a manta ray from a darker ocean. All sharp angles and non-reflective surfaces designed to devour radar signals, it was a technological marvel, the supposed future of untraceable reconnaissance. And it was a complete and utter failure. Gallo and his team treated it like a recalcitrant machine, a stubborn tool to be bent to their will. They spoke of it with frustration and anger. Eris saw something else. She saw in its sleek, dark fuselage not an object, but a dormant partner. Its silence seemed to her not one of malfunction, but of waiting. She understood its language better than the men who had built it. During a lull in the testing, as a flustered engineer cursed at a screen of corrupted code, Eris's hand unconsciously drifted to her left wrist. She pushed back the simple black band of her watch, massaging the joint. For a brief second, a faded tattoo on the delicate skin of her inner arm was exposed. It was a complex, stylized design, the spectral silhouette of a snow leopard, the ultimate alpine predator, seamlessly interwoven with the delicate, branching patterns of a circuit board. It was an old symbol from a life no one here knew she had lived. A marker of a unit that officially no longer existed. A memory of silence and shadow, of missions that were never spoken of and operatives who were never seen. She pulled the watch back into place just as Captain Gallo strode past, shaking his head after another failed simulation. He slammed his helmet down on a console. "Whole damn program's a bust," he muttered to another pilot. "This thing has no soul. You can't fly a Ghost." Eris watched him go, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in her eyes. He had no idea how right he was. The problem wasn't that the Chimera was a ghost. The problem was that none of them knew how to speak to one. The pressure mounted with the inevitability of a coming storm. A 4-star general from the Pentagon was arriving for a final go/no-go demonstration. The Chimera program, billions of dollars over budget and years behind schedule, was on the chopping block. Failure was not an option, it was an execution. The hangar, once merely frustrated, was now a tinderbox of raw nerves and frayed tempers. Colonel Vance's face was a grim mask of controlled anxiety, the fate of his command hanging on the performance of a single, unreliable machine. Captain Gallo was selected for the demonstration flight. His usual swagger was still present, but it was brittle, a thin veneer over a core of palpable tension. He strapped himself into the pilot's chair, the neural interface headset gleaming under the harsh hangar lights. "I've got this," he said, his voice a little too loud in the cavernous space. No one looked convinced. The initial launch sequence was flawless. The Chimera lifted from its platform with an eerie grace, its engines emitting a low, almost subsonic hum that was more of a feeling in the chest than a sound. On the main view screen, the drone's perspective showed it climbing smoothly into the stark blue of the desert sky. A collective, hopeful breath was held in the control room. The mission was a complex reconnaissance run through a network of narrow, winding canyons known as the Labyrinth, a test designed to push its maneuverability to the absolute limit. For 5 minutes, everything was perfect. Gallo, growing confident, pushed the drone faster, weaving through the rock formations with aggressive precision. Then it happened. A flicker on the data stream. A single, almost imperceptible tremor in the video feed. Alarms, soft at first, then rising to a frantic, piercing shriek, began to blare through the control room. Feedback spike. I'm losing the link. Gallo yelled, his face suddenly ashen. A trickle of blood ran from his nose. His hands clenched on controls that were useless, the connection was neural, and the feedback was pouring directly into his brain, causing his body to twitch in small, violent convulsions. On the screen, the Chimera pitched violently, its graceful flight devolving into an uncontrolled death spiral. It careened toward a sheer canyon wall, the granite face rushing up to meet it. Panic erupted. A young technician hammered uselessly at a frozen keyboard. Engineers shouted contradictory instructions. A predictive model on a side screen flashed from yellow to blood red, calculating impact in seconds. Vance stood frozen, watching billions of dollars and his entire career about to be pulverized into dust and carbon fiber against a cliffside. In the heart of the chaos, while every eye was fixed on the screens predicting imminent disaster, Eris moved. She did not run. She walked with a calm, deliberate purpose that was an island of serenity in the sea of panic. She crossed the room to a secondary maintenance terminal, a dusty, forgotten console with an old, amber monochrome screen that was rarely powered on. No one noticed her. Her fingers met the keypad. A silent storm of activity bloomed on the small screen. Her hands moved with a fluid, blinding speed, her fingers not just typing, but dancing across the keys. She wasn't fighting the system or trying to override it. She was communing with it, inputting lines of code that were less like commands and more like a soothing whisper in the machine's own native language. With the precision of a surgeon performing a brain operation, she identified the cascading error that had sent the neural feedback into a fatal loop. She didn't just block it. She isolated the corrupted data packet, purged it from the system's short-term memory, and rerouted the Chimera's primary flight control functions to her own terminal, completely bypassing Gallo's overloaded and now useless interface. The entire process took less than 4 seconds. On the main view screen, the effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. One moment, the Chimera was plummeting towards certain destruction. The next, it stopped. It simply stopped, hovering a mere 30 feet from the canyon wall, as motionless as a hummingbird. The frantic alarms cut out, plunging the control room into a stunning, profound silence. The only sounds were the low hum of the servers and Gallo's ragged, pained gasps. For a moment, the drone just hung there, a black specter against the red rock. Then, with a liquid grace that none of its designers had ever thought possible, the small attitude adjustment thrusters on its wings pulsed with a soft sigh. It executed a perfect, zero-radius pirouette, a balletic turn that defied physics. It leveled off and resumed its mission flight path down the center of the canyon as if the entire incident had been a planned, elegant maneuver. The room remained silent, every person frozen, their mouths agape. Eris took one step back from the terminal, her hands falling to her sides. Her work was done. She melted back into the shadows she had emerged from, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. The silence stretched for an eternity, thick with disbelief and awe. It was finally shattered by the sharp voice of the visiting general's aide, a sharp-eyed major. "Control, what in God's name was that? Who has the aircraft?" Every head in the room swiveled as one, their gazes searching, finally landing on the lone, still figure of Eris Thorne, standing quietly by the forgotten maintenance terminal. Captain Gallo, now disconnected from the neural interface, sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He stared at her, his arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by a raw, uncomprehending wonder. "How?" he stammered, the single word all he could manage. Colonel Vance approached her, his steps slow and deliberate. The institutional certainty that had defined him was gone, replaced by the deep-seated confusion of a man who has just witnessed the impossible. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier condescension. Explain what you just did. Eris's gaze remained fixed on the main screen, where the Chimera was now performing its reconnaissance patterns with a flawless, otherworldly grace. The neural link has a sympathetic feedback filter, she said, her voice even and calm. Captain Gallo was pushing the system too hard. He was fighting it. It created a resonance cascade. She paused, then added, you were trying to command it. It needs to be guided. Her simple explanation hung in the air, its profound implications slowly dawning on the engineers who had spent years trying to bludgeon the machine into submission. It wasn't a problem of code. It was a problem of philosophy. Near the back of the room, a grizzled master sergeant, a man who had been in uniform since before most of the pilots were born, squinted, his eyes narrowing as a distant memory surfaced. Task Force Zero, he muttered, the words barely audible, spoken more to himself than to anyone else. Heard they had a whisperer back in the day. Someone who could sync with prototype tech nobody else could touch. They said she could fly anything with a circuit board. He looked directly at Eris. Call sign was Nyx. The name, that of the Greek goddess of night, dropped into the charged silence of the room like a stone into a still pond. Eris did not acknowledge it, but for a brief, unguarded moment, a flicker of something ancient and deeply weary passed through her eyes. The visiting general, a man not easily impressed, was now intensely interested. The near disaster had transformed into a stunning display of unprecedented capability. But he needed more. The next morning, a new trial was ordered, unscheduled and designed to be brutally difficult. The objective: locate a small, mobile, electronically shielded target vehicle hidden somewhere within a 500 square mile sector of the test range. The target was disguised as a civilian geological survey truck, moving among hundreds of identical, legitimate vehicles, and it was programmed to change its spoofed electronic signature every 15 minutes. It was a search for a shape-shifting needle in a haystack of moving needles. This time, there was no discussion. Colonel Vance approached Eris not with an order, but with a request. Dr. Thorne, he said, his tone now one of profound deference. Will you fly the Chimera? She responded with a single, simple nod. The atmosphere in the control room was transformed. The swagger and nervous energy were gone, replaced by a tense, focused silence. Every person in the room was a student waiting for a masterclass to begin. Eris sat at the primary command console, the chair that had overwhelmed Gallo seeming to fit her perfectly. When she initiated the link, the data streams on the monitors were not jagged spikes, but serene, flowing lines, like a sleeping heartbeat. She didn't force the Chimera into the sky, she eased it into the air, letting it catch the morning thermals. She wasn't piloting a machine, she was wearing it. For hours, she flew, ignoring the cacophony of electronic decoys. She was using the Chimera as an extension of her own senses. She felt the subtle shifts in air temperature caused by the target vehicle's engine, perceived the faint traces of disturbed earth from its tires that were 0.8% heavier than the civilian models, and saw the unnatural patterns in the foliage where it had passed. She was thinking not like a pilot, but like a hunter. Hours bled into one another. The sun reached its zenith. The initial tense optimism had faded into a quiet, respectful resignation. The task was, as designed, impossible. Then, cutting through the low hum of the servers, her voice came, calm and clear. Target acquired. On the main screen, the view zoomed with impossible speed and clarity. It bypassed a cluster of decoy heat signatures and focused on a small, rocky overhang miles away. The image stabilized, piercing through camouflage netting. There, tucked perfectly into the shadows, was the target vehicle. A wave of stunned applause broke the silence. While the general celebrated, a priority message alert flashed on Colonel Vance's personal terminal. It was a Pentagon-level, eyes-only encrypted communique, a response to his urgent query for the unredacted file of one Dr. Eris Thorne. With trembling hands, he entered his credentials. The file opened. It was still almost entirely blacked out, but a few lines had been cleared. Subject: Thorne, Eris M. Former unit, Joint Special Operations Command / Task Force 7 / Designation, Task Force 0, Ghost Recon. Mission history, classified. Notable skill set, specialist, prototype neural interface piloting, call sign, NYX. Last known operation, Nightfall. Status, sole survivor. As Vance stared at the words, a figure moved to the center of the control room. It was the general's aide, now revealed to be a full colonel and the general's chief of staff. He was staring directly at Eris, his face a mask of utter disbelief and dawning reverence. "Nix?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. He was older now, but the scar over his left eye was unmistakable. He had been a junior intelligence analyst on her last mission, a terrified lieutenant who had listened to the comms as an entire legendary unit was wiped out. "My God," he whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It's you. We all thought you were dead. We thought you went down with the rest of them." The control room went absolutely still. The whispers about Task Force 0, the myth of the Whisperer, the legend of Operation Nightfall, it all coalesced around the quiet woman in the pilot's chair. They were in the room with a ghost. The colonel straightened his shoulders. He drew himself up to his full height, and with a motion so sharp it seemed to crack the air, he rendered a perfect, formal salute. It was not the casual salute for a superior. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect, the kind reserved for fallen heroes and living legends. One by one, the other uniformed personnel followed suit. Captain Gallo, humbled and awestruck, rose and brought his hand to his brow. The grizzled master sergeant stood at attention. Finally, Colonel Vance, his institutional arrogance completely stripped away, slowly raised his own hand in salute. They were honoring the ghost who had walked out of myth and into their lives. Eris slowly disconnected from the neural interface. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the room. Her expression remained unreadable, but for the first time, the deep, abiding weariness in her eyes was plain to see. She offered them no words, no speech. She simply gave a single, slow nod of her head. It was an acceptance. A shared understanding that some things are honored best by silence. The Chimera program was reborn, its core philosophy rewritten around what the Pentagon would later call the Thorn Principle. The story of the quiet consultant who tamed the ghost became a hushed legend at HAATC, a reminder that the most brilliant minds aren't always the loudest. They're the ones listening. What do you think is the line between a tool and a partner? And what other forgotten legends might still be walking among us? Comment respectfully below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth.